The morning mist clung to the iron gates of Blackwood Manor like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the sprawling estate that had stood sentinel over the English countryside for 3 centuries. Detective Inspector Marcus Hartwell of the Royal Protection Unit pulled his dark sedan to a stop before the imposing entrance, his trained eyes automatically scanning the perimeter for any signs of disturbance. The call had come in at dawn, urgent and cryptic, requesting immediate investigation of what the estate's caretaker had described as peculiar circumstances requiring discretion. Hartwell had served the Crown for 15 years, his reputation built on handling sensitive matters that required both investigative prowess and absolute confidentiality. The Blackwood estate belonged to Lord Edmund Blackwood, a prominent figure in Parliament whose family had served British royalty for generations. Any investigation here would need to be conducted with the utmost care, balancing thoroughness with the need to protect the family's standing in society. The heavy gates swung open with a metallic groan, operated by a nervous-looking groundskeeper who emerged from a small cottage nearby. Thomas Pemberton had worked the estate for over 30 years, his weathered face telling stories of countless seasons tending to the vast grounds. His hands shook slightly as he approached Hartwell's vehicle, clearly distressed by whatever he had discovered. "Inspector, thank God you've come," Pemberton said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been walking these grounds since I was a lad, and I've never seen anything like what I found this morning. Lord Blackwood is away on business in Scotland, and Lady Blackwood is visiting her sister in Bath. They don't know about this yet, and, frankly, I'm not sure how to tell them." Hartwell stepped out of his car, immediately noting the man's genuine distress. Years of experience had taught him to read people quickly, and Pemberton's fear appeared authentic rather than manufactured. The inspector adjusted his dark coat against the morning chill and gestured for the caretaker to lead the way. The estate's main drive stretched for nearly a mile, lined with ancient oak trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral overhead. Hartwell had visited Blackwood Manor once before, during a security assessment for a royal visit that ultimately never materialized. He remembered being impressed by the property's grandeur and the family's obvious pride in maintaining their ancestral home. The manor house itself was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, its honey-colored stone facade gleaming in the early sunlight despite its considerable age. As they walked, Pemberton began to explain the morning's events. He had risen early, as was his custom, to check on the greenhouse complex located in the estate's eastern gardens. The greenhouses were Lady Blackwood's particular passion, housing an extensive collection of rare orchids and exotic plants that required daily attention even in the family's absence. What he had discovered there had prompted his immediate call to the authorities. "I noticed the door to the main greenhouse was ajar when I approached," Pemberton explained, his breath visible in small puffs in the cool air. "That's unusual because I always lock everything up tight before leaving each evening. Lady Blackwood is very particular about temperature control for her plants. But, when I went to investigate, I found much more than an open door." They turned off the main path onto a smaller gravel walkway that wound through elaborate formal gardens. Even in late autumn, the landscaping was immaculate, with carefully trimmed hedges creating intricate patterns around dormant flower beds. Hartwell could see why the estate was considered one of the finest private properties in the region. The attention to detail was extraordinary, from the perfectly aligned garden borders to the spotless windows of the greenhouse complex that came into view ahead. The greenhouse stood like a crystal palace among the gardens, its Victorian iron framework supporting thousands of panes of glass that caught and reflected the morning light. It was larger than Hartwell had expected, actually consisting of 3 connected structures that housed different climate zones for various plant species. The central building rose to an impressive height, topped with ornate copper finials that had aged to a beautiful green patina. Pemberton led him to the main entrance, where the heavy glass door stood slightly open just as he had described. Before entering, Hartwell paused to examine the doorframe and surrounding area for any signs of forced entry. The lock mechanism appeared intact, with no scratches or damage that would indicate someone had broken in. This suggested either that someone had obtained a key, or that the greenhouse had been left unlocked intentionally. Inside, the greenhouse was warm and humid, filled with the earthy scent of rich soil and the delicate fragrance of blooming flowers. Rows of tables held hundreds of potted plants, from tiny seedlings to mature specimens with spectacular blooms. Lady Blackwood's collection was clearly the work of a serious botanist, with detailed labels and careful organization that spoke to years of dedicated cultivation. "Follow me to the back section," Pemberton said, leading Hartwell deeper into the greenhouse. "That's where I found it." They moved through the central aisle, past towering palm fronds and cascading vines that created an almost tropical atmosphere. The greenhouse's heating system hummed quietly in the background, maintaining the precise temperature requirements of the various plant species. Everything appeared normal until they reached the rear section of the main building, where the carefully maintained order gave way to obvious disturbance. Several large clay pots lay overturned on the floor, their contents spilled across the brick pathway. Rich, dark soil was scattered everywhere, and the heavy wooden table that had held these containers showed clear signs that someone had been digging or searching through the potting materials. What caught Hartwell's attention immediately, however, was not the mess itself but what protruded from one of the displaced soil piles. Partially buried in the scattered earth was what appeared to be a small wooden box, its dark wood polished to a high sheen that suggested considerable age and value. The box was roughly the size of a jewelry case, with intricate brass hinges and a sophisticated lock mechanism that spoke to expert craftsmanship. Soil clung to its edges, but the wood itself appeared undamaged despite its unexpected burial location. Pemberton stood back nervously as Hartwell knelt to examine the box more closely without disturbing it further. Years of training had taught him to document everything before making any changes to a potential crime scene. He photographed the box from multiple angles, noting its position relative to the overturned pots and scattered soil. "Did you touch this?" Hartwell asked, still focused on his examination. "No, sir. Soon as I saw it, I knew I was out of my depth. I've worked for the Blackwood family for 3 decades, and I've never seen this box before. It certainly doesn't belong in the greenhouse, and I can't imagine why anyone would bury it in a plant pot." That's when I decided to call for help. The box's construction suggested it was quite old, possibly dating back a century or more. The brass fittings had developed a rich patina, and the wood showed the kind of deep, lustrous finish that only came with age and careful maintenance. Most intriguingly, there appeared to be a small coat of arms engraved in the brass lock plate, though soil obscured the details. Hartwell carefully brushed away some of the loose earth, revealing more of the engraved design. What he saw made him pause in surprise. The coat of arms was not the Blackwood family crest, which he was familiar with from his previous visit to the estate. This was something different, featuring heraldic elements that suggested noble lineage but, from a family he couldn't immediately identify. "Pemberton, I need you to think carefully," Hartwell said, still studying the box. "Has anyone visited the estate recently? Any workers, delivery personnel, or guests who might have had access to this greenhouse?" The caretaker shook his head slowly. "No one's been here for weeks except myself and the weekly cleaning service that comes in for the main house. And they never come near the greenhouse. Lady Blackwood is very protective of her plants and doesn't allow anyone but family members and myself to tend to them." This information made this situation even more puzzling. If access to the greenhouse was truly limited to family and the caretaker, then how had this mysterious box found its way into the potting soil? And why would someone go to the trouble of burying it there in the first place? Hartwell stood and surveyed the rest of the greenhouse area, looking for any other signs of disturbance. Near the far wall, he noticed that several bags of potting soil had been opened and their contents partially used. Fresh soil was scattered around this area as well, suggesting that whoever had been here had been engaged in more than just hiding the wooden box. "These soil bags," Hartwell said, pointing to the disturbed area. "Were they opened recently?" "That's another strange thing," Pemberton replied. "I opened those bags myself just 3 days ago to repot some of Lady Blackwood's orchids. But I only used what I needed and sealed them back up properly. Someone's been into them since then, and they made quite a mess doing it." The implications were becoming clearer. Someone had gained access to the greenhouse and had been systematically searching through the potting materials, possibly looking for something specific. The buried box might have been what they were seeking, or it could have been something they were trying to hide. Either way, its presence suggested a deliberate act rather than a random occurrence. Hartwell's radio crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. The dispatcher was requesting an update on his status and estimated time of completion. He stepped away from Pemberton to respond, keeping his voice low to maintain the confidential nature of the investigation. "This is Hartwell. I'm going to need a forensics team out here, but keep it low-key. Unmarked vehicles and plain clothes only. We may have a significant find that requires careful handling." As he ended the radio transmission, Hartwell found himself considering the broader implications of the discovery. The Blackwood family's long history of service to the Crown meant that any investigation involving their property would be scrutinized at the highest levels. If this mysterious box contained something significant, it could have ramifications far beyond a simple case of trespassing or theft. The morning sun had risen higher while they worked, sending shafts of golden light through the greenhouse glass and creating an almost ethereal atmosphere around the scattered plants and soil. Despite the beauty of the setting, Hartwell felt the familiar weight of a complex investigation beginning to unfold. Experience had taught him that cases involving prominent families and mysterious discoveries rarely had simple explanations. Returning to Pemberton's side, Hartwell began to formulate his next steps. The box would need to be carefully excavated and examined, but not before the entire scene had been properly documented. The greenhouse itself would need to be treated as a potential crime scene until they could determine exactly what had transpired here. "Pemberton, I'm going to need you to lock up this greenhouse and keep everyone away until my team arrives," Hartwell instructed. "Don't mention this to anyone else for now. We need to understand what we're dealing with before word gets out." The caretaker nodded solemnly, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "What should I tell Lord and Lady Blackwood if they call?" "Tell them there's been a minor security issue that we're investigating as a precaution. Nothing more than that until I have a better picture of what's happened here." As they prepared to leave the greenhouse, Hartwell took one final look at the mysterious wooden box protruding from its earthen hiding place. Something about its appearance nagged at him, a sense that he had seen similar craftsmanship before. The style of the brasswork and the particular way the wood had been finished suggested European origins, possibly French or Austrian, from the late 19th or early 20th century. The walk back to the main house gave Hartwell time to consider the various possibilities. The box could contain valuable jewelry, important documents, or family heirlooms that someone was trying to hide or steal. Alternatively, it might hold evidence of some past wrongdoing that someone was desperate to conceal. Without opening it, there was no way to know which scenario they were dealing with. The forensics team would arrive within the hour, equipped with the tools and expertise needed to properly examine the box and its contents. Until then, Hartwell would use the time to learn more about the Blackwood family history and any potential connections to the mysterious heraldic symbols he had glimpsed on the box's lockplate. As they reached the main house, Pemberton paused on the front steps. "Inspector, there's one more thing you should know. About 6 months ago, Lady Blackwood mentioned that she thought someone had been in the greenhouse when she wasn't there. Plants had been moved slightly, and the temperature settings had been adjusted. We increased security after that, but perhaps we didn't do enough." This revelation added another layer to the mystery. If someone had been accessing the greenhouse for months, it suggested a planned operation rather than a random break-in. The question was whether the recent disturbance was connected to those earlier incidents or represented something entirely new. Hartwell made detailed notes about everything Pemberton had told him, knowing that these initial observations might prove crucial as the investigation developed. The caretaker's long tenure at the estate and his obvious familiarity with normal routines made him a valuable witness, someone who would notice even subtle changes in the environment. The sound of vehicles approaching on the gravel drive announced the arrival of the forensics team. Hartwell watched as 2 unmarked cars pulled up to the main house, their occupants already dressed in civilian clothes to maintain the low profile he had requested. Leading the team was Detective Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, a forensics specialist with whom Hartwell had worked on several previous sensitive cases. Mitchell emerged from the lead vehicle carrying a large case of examination equipment, her expression serious as she approached. Her team included a photographer, a fingerprint specialist, and an expert in historical artifacts who might be needed if the wooden box proved to be of significant age or value. "What have we got, Marcus?" Mitchell asked, automatically falling into the professional shorthand they had developed over years of working together. "Potentially significant discovery in a greenhouse on the property." Mysterious wooden box, possibly containing jewelry or valuables, found buried in potting soil. No clear indication of how it got there or who had access. The family is away, and the caretaker discovered it this morning. Mitchell nodded, already formulating her approach to the examination. Historical significance? Possibly. The box appears to be antique, with heraldic markings that don't match the property owner's family crest. We'll need to document everything carefully before we even think about opening it. The team gathered their equipment and followed Hartwell and Pemberton back toward the greenhouse complex. The morning mist had completely cleared now, and the autumn sunshine gave the estate grounds an almost pastoral beauty that belied the mystery they were there to investigate. As they approached the greenhouse, Hartwell briefed the team on the layout and the specific location of the discovery. The glass building sparkled in the sunlight, its Victorian elegance creating an incongruous backdrop for what might prove to be a significant criminal investigation. Inside the greenhouse, the forensics team immediately set to work establishing a perimeter around the disturbed area and beginning their systematic documentation of the scene. The photographer captured images from every conceivable angle, while the fingerprint specialist began dusting surfaces for any traces that might indicate who had been handling the plant pots and soil bags. Mitchell knelt beside the partially buried box, studying it with the practiced eye of someone who had examined countless pieces of evidence over her career. After several minutes of careful observation, she looked up at Hartwell with an expression that combined professional excitement with obvious concern. "Marcus, I think you need to see this more closely," she said, pointing to the brass lock plate. "These aren't just random heraldic markings. This coat of arms has very specific elements that suggest royal or noble connections. If I'm reading this correctly, this box may have historical significance beyond just its monetary value." The investigation had taken on an entirely new dimension. What had begun as a simple case of trespassing or theft might now involve items of historical importance, possibly with connections to British nobility or even the royal family itself. Hartwell felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied cases where the stakes were higher than they initially appeared. As the forensics team continued their meticulous work, Hartwell found himself studying the greenhouse environment more carefully. The controlled climate, the careful organization of the plant collection, and the obvious expertise required to maintain such a facility all suggested that Lady Blackwood was far more than a casual gardener. This was the domain of someone with serious botanical knowledge and considerable resources. The question that nagged at him was whether the greenhouse had been chosen as a hiding place because of its security and limited access, or whether there was some other connection between the location and the mysterious box. The careful burial in potting soil suggested someone familiar with the greenhouse layout and routines, possibly someone who knew that certain areas were less frequently disturbed. Mitchell's voice interrupted his thoughts. "We're ready to begin the extraction process. Do you want us to proceed, or would you prefer to contact higher authorities first?" It was a crucial decision point. Once they opened the box, there would be no going back. Whatever they found inside would need to be dealt with according to proper protocols, and if the contents proved to be of significant historical or monetary value, the investigation would likely be elevated to much higher levels within the Royal Protection Unit. Hartwell weighed the options quickly. The discovery had been made on private property belonging to a prominent family, using proper legal procedures. The caretaker had called for official assistance, providing legitimate grounds for the investigation. Most importantly, delaying the examination might compromise the integrity of whatever evidence the box contained. Proceed with the extraction, Hartwell decided. Document everything, but let's see what we're dealing with before we make any additional notifications. The next hour would prove to be one of the most significant in Detective Inspector Marcus Hartwell's career, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. As Mitchell and her team began the careful process of extracting the wooden box from its earthen hiding place, the morning sun continued to stream through the greenhouse glass, illuminating what would soon be revealed as the first piece in a puzzle that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the Blackwood family and their centuries-old connection to the British Crown. The wooden box emerged from the soil like an ancient treasure being unearthed from an archaeological site. Detective Sergeant Sarah Mitchell's gloved hands moved with practiced precision as she carefully brushed away the last remnants of potting soil from its intricately carved surface. The box was smaller than it had initially appeared while partially buried, roughly 8 inches long by 6 inches wide, but its construction spoke of master craftsmanship from a bygone era. Under the bright examination lights that the forensics team had set up, the true beauty of the artifact became apparent. The wood was definitely mahogany, its deep reddish-brown color enriched by what appeared to be decades, possibly centuries, of careful maintenance. The brass fittings had been worked by hand, featuring delicate scrollwork and botanical motifs that suggested French or Austrian origin from the late Victorian period. Detective Inspector Marcus Hartwell watched intently as Mitchell began her preliminary examination of the lock mechanism. The coat of arms engraved in the brass plate was now clearly visible, and what he saw made his pulse quicken with professional excitement and concern. The heraldic design featured a crown lion rampant, 3 fleur-de-lis, and a distinctive cross pattern that he recognized from his training in European noble families. "Sarah, are you seeing what I'm seeing in those markings?" Hartwell asked, keeping his voice low despite the fact that only Pemberton and the forensics team were present. Mitchell looked up from her examination, her expression grave. "If I'm reading this correctly, this coat of arms belongs to the House of Orleans, a branch of the French royal family. But there are additional elements here that suggest connections to the British nobility as well. This isn't just any antique jewelry box, Marcus. This could be a piece with genuine historical significance." The implications were staggering. If the box indeed belonged to or was connected with European nobility, its presence buried in the Blackwood Estate's greenhouse raised questions that extended far beyond simple theft or trespassing. The House of Orleans had complex historical ties to Britain, particularly during the periods of French political upheaval in the 19th and early 20th centuries when many French nobles sought refuge in England. Thomas Pemberton, who had been standing quietly nearby, suddenly spoke up. "Inspector, I just remembered something that might be important. Lord Blackwood's grandmother, the late Lady Catherine Blackwood, used to tell stories about French nobles who stayed at the estate during the wars. She said some of them left items here for safekeeping, things that were never claimed after the Troubles ended." This revelation added an entirely new dimension to the mystery. If Lady Catherine's stories were true, the greenhouse discovery might not represent recent criminal activity but, rather, the emergence of items that had been hidden on the estate for decades, possibly forgotten until someone recently learned of their existence and came looking for them. Hartwell immediately began formulating new theories about the timeline of events. Someone with knowledge of the family's wartime history might have gained access to estate records or family documents that revealed the location of hidden valuables. The recent disturbances that Pemberton had mentioned could represent a systematic search that had finally yielded results. "Pemberton, what happened to Lady Catherine's personal papers and documents when she passed?" Hartwell asked. "Most everything went to Lord Blackwood when she died about 5 years ago. He had several boxes of her things moved to the estate's library, but I don't believe he ever went through them thoroughly. Lady Catherine was quite elderly when she passed, and her memories of the war years weren't always reliable toward the end. The library would need to be searched for any documents that might shed light on wartime guests and any items they might have left behind. But, first, the immediate priority was determining what the wooden box contained and whether its contents matched the historical significance suggested by its construction and heraldic markings." Mitchell had completed her external examination and was now preparing to attempt opening the lock mechanism. The brass fittings appeared to be in excellent condition despite their apparent age, suggesting that the box had been well cared for until its recent burial in the greenhouse soil. "The lock is more sophisticated than typical jewelry boxes of this period," Mitchell explained as she worked. "It's a double-action mechanism with what appears to be a secondary security feature. This was definitely designed to protect something of considerable value." Using specialized tools designed to avoid damaging historical artifacts, Mitchell began the delicate process of working with the lock mechanism. The greenhouse had fallen silent except for the gentle hum of the climate control systems and the soft click of metal on metal as she manipulated the lock components. After nearly 20 minutes of careful work, there was a distinct click, followed by a second, softer sound as the lock mechanism disengaged. Mitchell paused, looking at Hartwell for confirmation before proceeding to open the box. "Go ahead," Hartwell said, his camera ready to document whatever they found inside. The lid opened smoothly on well-maintained hinges, revealing an interior lined with deep blue velvet that had faded only slightly over time. What lay nestled in that velvet lining caused everyone present to draw their breath in simultaneous amazement. The box contained what was unmistakably a complete set of antique jewelry, but not just any jewelry. Even to Hartwell's untrained eye, the pieces were clearly of museum quality, featuring precious stones and metalwork that spoke of royal or imperial origins. The centerpiece was a necklace of extraordinary beauty, featuring alternating diamonds and sapphires set in what appeared to be platinum, with a pendant containing a central sapphire of remarkable size and clarity. Surrounding the necklace were matching earrings, a bracelet, and what appeared to be a small tiara or coronet, all featuring the same combination of diamonds and sapphires in settings that demonstrated the highest level of craftsmanship. Each piece was carefully wrapped in silk that had yellowed with age but had protected the jewelry from tarnishing or damage. Mitchell was already photographing the contents from multiple angles, but she paused in her work to point out a small detail that had caught her attention. "Marcus, look at the inside of the lid. There's an inscription here." Hartwell leaned closer to examine the area Mitchell was indicating. Engraved in the blue velvet lining was a small brass plate bearing an inscription in French, "Pour ma chère Marie-Louise, avec tout mon amour éternel. Henri, Comte d'Eu, 1889. The inscription provided their first concrete clue about the jewelry's origins and ownership. Henri, Comte d'Eu, was a historical figure known to students of European nobility, a member of the House of Orleans who had married into the Brazilian imperial family. The date of 1889 was particularly significant, as it coincided with the Brazilian Republican Revolution that forced the imperial family into European exile. "This is starting to make sense," Hartwell said, speaking as much to himself as to the others. If Henri, Comte d'Eu, gave this jewelry to Marie-Louise, and if they sought refuge in England during the Brazilian troubles, the pieces might have ended up in British noble families' care for safekeeping. Pemberton was studying the jewelry with obvious awe. "Inspector, I think I know why this ended up at Blackwood Manor." Lord Blackwood's great-grandfather, Sir William Blackwood, was known to have assisted European nobles who came to England during various political upheavals. The family has always been proud of their role in helping refugees from continental troubles. This family history provided a plausible explanation for how the jewelry had come to be at the estate, but it still didn't explain why it was buried in the greenhouse or who had been searching for it. The recent disturbances suggested that someone had specific knowledge about the jewelry's location, knowledge that might have come from recently discovered documents or family records. Mitchell continued her detailed examination of each piece, noting the quality of the stones and the sophistication of the settings. "Marcus, I'm not an expert in historical jewelry, but these pieces appear to be worth a considerable fortune. The sapphires alone are of exceptional quality, and the diamonds show the kind of cutting precision that was rare in the 19th century." The monetary value was certainly significant, but Hartwell was more concerned with the historical and legal implications of the discovery. If the jewelry had indeed been placed at Blackwood Manor for safekeeping by 19th-century refugees, questions of rightful ownership would be complex. The descendants of Henri and Marie-Louise might have legitimate claims, as might the Blackwood family if the pieces had been formally entrusted to their care. More immediately pressing was the question of who had been searching for the jewelry and how they had learned of its existence. The careful burial in the greenhouse suggested someone who had specific knowledge of the estate layout and the family's absence, possibly someone with inside information or access to historical documents. Hartwell's radio buzzed with an incoming message from headquarters. The dispatcher was relaying a priority communication that required his immediate attention. He stepped away from the group to take the call, recognizing the voice of his superior, Chief Inspector David Blackmore. "Hartwell, I've just received an interesting call about your current investigation. Are you dealing with a discovery of historical artifacts at the Blackwood estate?" The question surprised Hartwell, as he had not yet filed any reports about the morning's discoveries. "Sir, how did you know about the artifacts?" "Because 20 minutes ago, we received a call from the French Embassy's cultural attaché. Apparently, someone contacted them earlier today claiming to have information about missing jewelry belonging to the House of Orleans. They mentioned the Blackwood estate specifically. This development changed everything about the investigation. If someone had contacted the French embassy about Orleans jewelry at the same time they were making their discovery, It suggested coordinated activity rather than coincidental timing. Someone had known exactly what was buried in the greenhouse and had been prepared to claim it through official channels. "Sir, we need to secure this scene immediately and contact higher authorities." This appears to be much more significant than a simple theft case. "Agreed. I'm sending additional security to the estate, and I want you to transfer everything to our secure facility for proper examination. The French cultural attaché is requesting a meeting this afternoon to discuss the matter." As Hartwell ended the call, he realized that their quiet investigation was about to become a much more complex international incident. The involvement of foreign diplomatic representatives meant that the case would now be handled at the highest levels of government, with potential implications for British-French relations. Returning to the greenhouse, Hartwell found Mitchell completing her preliminary documentation of the jewelry. Each piece had been photographed individually and, collectively, with detailed notes about their condition and apparent age. The wooden box itself had been examined for any additional clues about its origins or recent handling. "Change of plans," Hartwell announced. "We're dealing with an international situation now. The French embassy is involved, and we need to transfer everything to headquarters for secure storage and further examination." The news clearly startled Pemberton, who had been watching the proceedings with growing concern about the implications for his employers. "Inspector, what should I tell Lord and Lady Blackwood when they return? This is going to be quite a shock for them." "For now, tell them only that we've discovered historical artifacts on the property that may have connections to wartime refugees. Don't mention the specific details or the involvement of foreign governments until we have a better understanding of the situation." The forensics team began the careful process of packing the jewelry and the wooden box for transport to headquarters. Each piece was individually wrapped and documented, with chain of custody forms prepared to ensure that nothing could be questioned about the handling of the evidence. As they worked, Hartwell found himself considering the broader implications of the discovery. If the jewelry was indeed authentic Orleans family property, its value would be enormous, not just in monetary terms but as cultural and historical artifacts. The French government would undoubtedly want to examine the pieces and potentially claim them as part of France's national heritage. However, the legal situation was far from clear. If the jewelry had been legitimately entrusted to the Blackwood family for safekeeping, they might have valid claims to ownership, especially if no other heirs could be established. The documentation of the entrustment would be crucial, which meant that the search of Lady Catherine's papers in the estate library had become even more important. Mitchell had finished packing the jewelry and was now examining the wooden box's interior for any additional clues. Hidden beneath the velvet lining of one corner, she discovered a small folded document that had been carefully concealed. "Marcus, there's a paper hidden in the box. It looks like it might be some kind of receipt or certificate." The document was yellowed with age and written in French, but the official seals and signatures were clearly visible. Hartwell's limited knowledge of French allowed him to make out certain key words and phrases that suggested the document was indeed related to the jewelry's ownership and transfer. "This could be the documentation we need to establish the legal chain of ownership," Hartwell said. "But we'll need proper translation and authentication before we can determine its significance." The discovery of the document added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. If it proved to be authentic documentation of the jewelry's transfer to the Blackwood family, it would strengthen their claim to legal ownership. If it suggested temporary entrustment with the expectation of eventual return, the French government's interest would be justified. As the team prepared to leave the greenhouse, Hartwell took one final look around the space where the discovery had been made. The overturned plant pots and scattered soil would need to be cleaned up, but first he wanted to ensure that they hadn't missed any other hidden items or clues about recent activities. The greenhouse's sophisticated climate control systems and security features made it an ideal location for hiding valuable items, but they also meant that any unauthorized access should have been detected and recorded. Hartwell made a mental note to examine the estate's security systems and any surveillance footage that might show who had been in the greenhouse recently. Pemberton locked the greenhouse behind them as they made their way back to the main house. The caretaker's knowledge of the estate's history and his long tenure with the family made him a valuable resource for the investigation, but Hartwell also needed to consider whether his access to the greenhouse made him a potential suspect in the recent disturbances. The drive back to headquarters gave Hartwell time to organize his thoughts and prepare for what he knew would be a complex international investigation. The involvement of the French embassy meant that diplomatic protocols would need to be followed, and the potential value of the jewelry meant that security would be paramount. As they reached the main road, Hartwell's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but unsettling. "The jewelry belongs to my family. I have proof. We need to meet." Someone was watching the investigation closely enough to know about their discovery and felt confident enough to make direct contact with the lead investigator. This suggested either inside knowledge of the case or surveillance capabilities that raised serious security concerns. The afternoon meeting with the French cultural attaché would need to address not only the question of the jewelry's ownership but also the security implications of unauthorized knowledge about the investigation. Hartwell realized that what had begun as a simple estate security matter had evolved into something that could affect international relations and require involvement from the highest levels of British intelligence and security services. As the convoy of unmarked vehicles carrying the Orleans jewelry made its way through the English countryside toward London, Detective Inspector Marcus Hartwell reflected on how dramatically the morning's events had exceeded his expectations. The elegant wooden box and its precious contents had opened a window into a fascinating piece of European history, but they had also raised questions that would challenge his investigative skills and potentially impact British diplomatic relations with France. The real investigation, he realized, was just beginning. The secure examination room at Royal Protection Unit headquarters buzzed with activity as experts from multiple disciplines gathered around the Orleans jewelry collection. Detective Inspector Marcus Hartwell had never seen such an assembly of specialists in one place: art historians from the British Museum, gemologists from Hatton Garden, diplomatic representatives from the Foreign Office, and handwriting experts from Scotland Yard's Historical Documents Division. Dr. Elizabeth Chambers, the British Museum's senior curator of European decorative arts, had been studying the jewelry for 3 hours with the intensity of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. Her preliminary assessment had already confirmed what Hartwell suspected: the pieces were not only authentic but represented some of the finest examples of 19th-century European court jewelry ever discovered in Britain. "The craftsmanship is absolutely extraordinary," Dr. Chambers explained to the assembled group. "The sapphires are of Kashmir origin, which was the most prized source during the late Victorian period. The diamond cutting shows the precision work of either Cartier or Boucheron, the premier Paris jewelers who worked for European royalty. These pieces would have been commissioned for someone of the highest social rank." The gemologist, Mr. Harrison Webb, nodded in agreement as he examined the central sapphire through his specialized loupe. "The stone quality is museum grade. This central sapphire alone would be worth several £100,000 at today's market prices. The complete set, if authenticated as genuine Orleans family jewelry, would be valued in the millions." While the experts continued their technical analysis, Hartwell's attention was focused on the historical document that Detective Sergeant Sarah Mitchell had discovered hidden in the box's lining. The French translator from the Foreign Office, Mademoiselle Sophie Dubois, had been working on a complete translation, and her findings were reshaping their understanding of the jewelry's journey to England. Inspector Hartwell, Mademoiselle Dubois called from her position at the document analysis table. "I believe I have completed the translation, and it provides very significant information about the legal status of these pieces." The document, dated September 15, 1889, was written on official letterhead of the Brazilian Imperial Court and bore the personal seal of Henri, Comte d'Eu. The translation revealed it to be a formal letter of entrustment, written in the elegant French of the diplomatic corps, addressed to Sir William Blackwood of Blackwood Manor, England. According to the letter, the Comte d'Eu was entrusting the jewelry collection to Sir William's care during a period of temporary political difficulties in Brazil, with the understanding that the pieces would be returned when the circumstances permit safe residence in our homeland. The document specifically mentioned that the jewelry had belonged to my beloved wife Marie-Louise and represented the last tangible connection to our life of happiness before the Troubles. Most importantly for the legal investigation, the letter included detailed descriptions of each piece and specified that Sir William was to hold these precious items in trust for the Conse family, with provisions for their eventual return to legitimate heirs of our bloodline. The document was witnessed by 2 other French nobles and bore official seals that appeared authentic to the expert's preliminary examination. "This changes the entire legal framework of the case," said Margaret Thornton, the Foreign Office's senior legal advisor. "If this document is authentic, it establishes clear intent for temporary entrustment rather than permanent transfer of ownership. The Blackwood family would be legal custodians rather than owners." The implications were significant for all parties involved. The French government's interest in claiming the jewelry as national cultural patrimony would be complicated by the private family ownership established in the letter. However, the Blackwood family's claim would be limited to custodial rights unless they could demonstrate that the original owner's bloodline had been extinguished. Hartwell's investigation now required determining whether any legitimate heirs of Henri, Comte d'Eu, and Marie-Louise still existed, and whether the mysterious person who had contacted him earlier might represent such a bloodline. The text message he had received remained a source of concern, suggesting someone with detailed knowledge of the case and possible familial claims. Dr. Chambers had moved her attention to the wooden box itself, examining the construction techniques and materials for clues about its origins and age. Her findings supported the late 19th century dating suggested by the letter, but also revealed something unexpected. "Inspector, there's something unusual about this box that I think you should see," Dr. Chambers said, indicating a section of the interior lining. "There's a hidden compartment in the base that we initially missed. The velvet lining conceals a second level that appears to contain additional items." Using specialized tools designed for historical artifacts, Dr. Chambers carefully lifted a section of the velvet lining to reveal a shallow hidden compartment containing several folded papers and what appeared to be small photographs. The photographs, sepia-toned and mounted on thick cardboard typical of late 19th century portraiture, showed elegantly dressed individuals in formal court attire. The papers included additional correspondence, all in French, and what appeared to be genealogical charts showing family connections and birth dates. These documents would require careful translation and authentication, but they potentially contained crucial information about the Orleans family's descendants and their current whereabouts. One photograph in particular caught Hartwell's attention. It showed a young woman wearing the very necklace they had discovered, posed in the formal style of royal portraiture from the period. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was the inscription Marie-Louise, Princesse d'Eu, 1888. This confirms the connection between the jewelry and Marie-Louise, Dr. Chambers observed. But, more importantly, it provides visual documentation that could be crucial for authentication purposes. If any descendants come forward claiming the jewelry, this photograph would be essential evidence for verifying their claims. The genealogical charts proved even more revealing. Written in the meticulous hand of a professional clerk, they traced the Orleans EU family line from the early 19th century through to the 1920s, including births, marriages, and deaths of family members scattered across Europe after their exile from Brazil. Mademoiselle Dubois studied the charts carefully, noting several names and dates that appeared significant. "Inspector, according to these records, Henri and Marie-Louise had 3 children who survived to adulthood. 2 sons and 1 daughter. The charts show their marriages and the names of their children, suggesting that legitimate descendants might indeed still exist." This information transformed the investigation from a historical curiosity into an active case involving potentially numerous living claimants. Each descendant listed on the genealogical charts would need to be researched and potentially contacted to determine their current status and any interest in claiming their ancestors' jewelry. Hartwell's phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number that had contacted him earlier. This time, the message was more detailed. "I am Marie-Louise's great-granddaughter. I can prove my lineage. The jewelry was stolen from our family storage in London last month. I know who took it." The claim of recent theft added an entirely new dimension to the case. If the jewelry had indeed been stolen from a London storage facility, it suggested that the Orleans descendants had maintained custody of their ancestors' property and that the burial at Blackwood Manor represented recent criminal activity rather than historical entrustment. "We need to investigate this theft claim immediately," Hartwell told Mitchell. "Contact the Metropolitan Police and see if there have been any reports of stolen historical jewelry in the past month. Also, see if we can trace this phone number and arrange to meet with whoever is making these claims." The afternoon meeting with the French cultural attaché, Monsieur Jean-Claude Moreau, had been scheduled for 4 p.m., and Hartwell wanted to have as much information as possible before that diplomatic encounter. The French government's interest in the case would be influenced by whether they viewed the jewelry as stolen French cultural property or as legitimately held private family assets. Dr. Chambers continued her examination of the additional documents from the hidden compartment, discovering what appeared to be bank records and property receipts dating from the early 20th century. These documents suggested that the Orleans-EU family had maintained significant financial assets in London banking institutions, providing another potential trail for tracking their descendants. "Inspector," Dr. Chambers called out, "these banking records show regular transactions through Coutts Bank on the Strand, continuing into the 1920s. If the family maintained accounts there for decades after their initial exile, the bank might have records of current account holders or authorized contacts." Coutts Bank, known for its discretion in serving wealthy and noble families, would likely have comprehensive records going back generations. However, accessing those records would require legal warrants and careful negotiation with bank management, a process that could take weeks or months to complete. Hartwell's radio crackled with an urgent message from headquarters dispatch. "Inspector Hartwell, we have a woman at the front desk claiming to be Marie-Louise Orleans' great-granddaughter. She's requesting to speak with you about the jewelry case and says she has documents proving her identity." The timing was remarkable, almost suspiciously so. Less than an hour after receiving text messages from someone claiming Orleans' family lineage, a woman had appeared at headquarters with similar claims. Hartwell wondered if the person texting him was the same individual now waiting downstairs. "Have her wait in interview room 3, Hartwell instructed. "I'll be down in 10 minutes. And make sure she's searched for any recording devices or cameras. This case is too sensitive for any breaches of security." Before leaving the examination room, Hartwell took one final look at the jewelry spread across the analysis table. The sapphires caught the fluorescent light and threw back deep blue reflections that seemed to hold secrets of their own. Each piece represented not just monetary value but a tangible connection to a dramatic period in European history when empires fell and noble families fled their homelands carrying only their most precious possessions. The woman waiting in interview room 3 was elegantly dressed in a manner that suggested both good taste and sufficient wealth to maintain it. She appeared to be in her 50s, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon and intelligent dark eyes that assessed Hartwell with the same intensity he was using to study her. "Inspector Hartwell, I am Isabel Morosantos," she said, extending a gloved hand in greeting. "I believe you have discovered jewelry that belongs to my family." Her accent carried traces of both French and Portuguese influences, which would be consistent with the Orleans-EU family's Brazilian connections. Her surname of Morosantos also suggested the kind of hyphenated nobility common among European exile families who had intermarried across cultural lines. "Madame Morosantos, I understand you have information about the jewelry we discovered this morning. Can you provide documentation of your claimed relationship to the Orleans-EU family?" She opened an elegant leather portfolio and withdrew several documents, including what appeared to be official birth certificates, marriage records, and genealogical charts similar to those found in the hidden compartment of the wooden box. The papers were organized with the precision of someone who had been prepared for this conversation for some time. "My great-grandmother was Marie-Louise, Princesse d'Eu," she explained, pointing to specific entries on the genealogical chart. "She was my grandmother's mother. These documents trace the family line through my grandmother Marguerite, who settled in London in 1920, and my mother Catherine, who married my father Felipe Santos, a Portuguese diplomat." The documentation appeared professionally prepared and included authentication seals from various European governmental agencies. If authentic, it would establish a clear bloodline connection to the original owners of the jewelry. However, Hartwell's training made him cautious about accepting any documents without proper verification. "Madam, you mentioned in your message that the jewelry was recently stolen. Can you provide details about when and where this occurred?" Her expression grew troubled as she reached for additional papers from her portfolio. The jewelry was kept in a private safety deposit box at Harrods Bank in London, where my family has maintained accounts since the 1920s. Last month, someone gained unauthorized access to the box using forged documentation. The bank's investigation determined that the thieves had extensive knowledge of our family history and banking arrangements. She handed him copies of police reports filed with the Metropolitan Police, along with bank documentation confirming the theft of historical jewelry and family documents from Safety Deposit Box 247 at the Harrods Bank facility. The reports were dated exactly 3 weeks earlier, which aligned with the timeframe of the mysterious activities at Blackwood Manor. Do you have any idea who might have been responsible for the theft, or how they gained access to information about your family's banking arrangements? Inspector, this is where the situation becomes particularly disturbing, she replied, her voice carrying a note of genuine fear. For the past 6 months, someone has been contacting various members of our family, claiming to be researching the Orleans EU history for a book or documentary. They asked very specific questions about family documents, properties in England, and any jewelry or artifacts that might have survived from the Brazilian period. The pattern suggested a sophisticated operation designed to gather intelligence about the family's assets before attempting to steal them. The theft from the bank vault would have required insider knowledge and professional skills, while the subsequent burial at Blackwood Manor suggested someone with detailed knowledge of the estate's history and current security arrangements. Did this researcher provide any identification or credentials that might help us track them down? Madame Morosantos reached into her portfolio once more and withdrew a business card and several letters. He called himself Dr. William Ashford and claimed to be affiliated with Cambridge University's Department of European History. However, when my cousin contacted the university to verify his credentials, they had no record of anyone by that name in their department. The business card was professionally printed on high-quality paper, but a quick phone call to Cambridge would confirm whether Dr. William Ashford was a legitimate academic or an assumed identity. The letters were written in excellent English with no obvious grammatical errors or stylistic peculiarities that might provide clues about the author's true identity. Hartwell studied the timeline emerging from Madame Morosantos' account. 6 months of careful research into the family's history, followed by a sophisticated theft from a high-security bank vault, and, then, the burial of the stolen jewelry at a private estate with historical connections to the family's wartime refuge. The operation showed remarkable patience and planning. Madam, I need to ask you directly, have you ever visited Blackwood Manor, or do you have any personal knowledge of your family's historical connection to the estate? No, Inspector. Until this morning, I had never heard of Blackwood Manor. Our family records mention that some jewelry and documents were left with English friends during the Brazilian troubles, but the specific names and locations were never recorded in the documents that survived. We always assumed those items were lost forever. This response aligned with the historical evidence they had discovered, but it also raised new questions about how the mysterious Dr. Ashford had learned about the Blackwood connection. The information would have required access to documents that even the Orleans descendants didn't possess, or knowledge of estate records that were not publicly available. Hartwell's radio buzzed with another message from headquarters. The French cultural attaché had arrived early for his meeting and was requesting an immediate conference with all parties involved in the investigation. Monsieur Moreau was apparently accompanied by representatives from the Charité Nationale, France's national police, suggesting that the French government was treating the case as a matter of significant importance. Madame Morosantos, I'm going to need you to remain available for further questioning. We have French government representatives arriving for a meeting about this case, and your presence might be valuable for establishing the facts. As they prepared to leave the interview room, Hartwell reflected on how dramatically the investigation had evolved since the morning's discovery in the greenhouse. What had begun as a simple estate security matter now involved international law enforcement, diplomatic considerations, and a sophisticated criminal operation that had successfully stolen historically significant artifacts. The afternoon meeting would need to address not only the question of rightful ownership but also the immediate security concerns raised by the ongoing criminal investigation. Someone with considerable resources and expertise was still at large, and their interest in the Orleans jewelry suggested that other valuable historical artifacts might be at risk. The Orleans jewelry case had become one of the most complex investigations of Detective Inspector Marcus Hartwell's career, combining elements of art theft, international law, diplomatic relations, and family history in ways that challenged both his investigative skills and his understanding of European noble heritage. The afternoon ahead would determine whether the case could be resolved through diplomatic channels or would require a full international criminal investigation. The conference room at Royal Protection Unit headquarters had been transformed into a miniature diplomatic summit, with flags from both Britain and France flanking the polished mahogany table where representatives from multiple governments now sat in careful arrangement. Detective Inspector Marcus Hartwell found himself at the center of an international incident that had escalated far beyond anything he had anticipated when he first drove through the gates of Blackwood Manor that misty morning. Monsieur Jean-Claude Moreau, the French cultural attaché, had indeed arrived with representatives from the Charité Nationale, but also with Dr. Philippe Dubois, a specialist in recovered cultural property from the Ministry of Culture. Their presence indicated that the French government viewed the Orleans jewelry not merely as a private family matter but as potentially significant cultural patrimony that had been illegally removed from French soil. Seated across from the French delegation was Isabelle Moreau Santos, her elegant composure unchanged despite the intimidating array of officials now examining her family's claims. Her lawyer, Mr. Geoffrey Hamilton of Hamilton and Associates, had arrived within an hour of her initial interview, armed with additional documentation supporting her lineage and her family's ownership of the stolen jewelry. Lord Edmund Blackwood had been reached by telephone at his estate in Scotland and had immediately begun the journey south, accompanied by his solicitor and his family's historical archivist. The Blackwood family's position was complex. They acknowledged their ancestors' role as custodians but maintained that the century-plus passage of time and the apparent abandonment of the jewelry created legitimate claims to ownership. Dr. Elizabeth Chambers from the British Museum had completed her authentication analysis and was prepared to present findings that would definitively establish whether the jewelry was genuine Orleans EU family property. Her preliminary conclusions had already confirmed the piece's authenticity, but the formal presentation would carry significant weight in determining the international legal framework governing the case. Ladies and gentlemen, Hartwell began, calling the meeting to order. We are here to address the discovery of historically significant jewelry at Blackwood Manor and the various claims regarding its rightful ownership. Before we proceed with ownership discussions, I must emphasize that this remains an active criminal investigation involving theft, trespassing, and possibly international trafficking of stolen cultural property. Monsieur Moreau immediately leaned forward, his diplomatic training evident in his careful choice of words. Inspector Hartwell, the French government appreciates Britain's diligence in recovering these items, which we believe may represent illegally exported French cultural patrimony. We are prepared to offer full cooperation with your criminal investigation while asserting France's interest in ensuring these artifacts are properly preserved and displayed for the public benefit. Mr. Hamilton responded quickly on behalf of his client. With respect to our French colleagues, these items represent private family property that was legitimately removed from both France and Brazil during periods of political upheaval. My client's family has maintained continuous legal ownership, and the recent theft from their London bank vault in no way diminishes their rightful claims. The legal complexity was immediately apparent. French law regarding cultural patrimony was notoriously strict, often claiming state ownership of significant historical artifacts regardless of private ownership claims. British law, however, traditionally favored established property rights and would likely recognize the Orleans family's claims if properly documented. Dr. Chambers presented her authentication findings with the precision of a scholar addressing an academic conference. The jewelry was unquestionably authentic, dating to the 1880s and showing the craftsmanship of premier Parisian jewelry houses. The sapphires were of cashmere origin, consistent with the finest court jewelry of the period. Most significantly, microscopic examination had revealed makers' marks that definitively identified the pieces as products of Cartier's workshops during their golden age of imperial commissions. The historical significance of this collection cannot be overstated, Dr. Chambers explained. These pieces represent some of the finest examples of 19th-century European court jewelry ever discovered in Britain. They provide tangible connections to the Brazilian Empire, the Orleans royal lineage, and the broader European refugee experience during the political upheavals of the late 19th century. Hartwell's investigation had revealed additional crucial information during the afternoon's work. The mysterious Dr. William Ashford who had contacted the Orleans family members was indeed fictitious, but telephone records and surveillance footage from Harrods Bank had provided leads about the actual perpetrators of the theft. "We have identified at least 3 individuals involved in the bank theft," Hartwell reported. 2 men and 1 woman, all showing professional expertise in security systems and document forgery. Interpol has confirmed that similar methods were used in recent thefts of historical artifacts in Paris and Vienna, suggesting we're dealing with an organized ring specializing in noble family treasures. The international scope of the criminal operation added urgency to the ownership discussions. If the thieves remained active and were targeting other Orleans family assets, immediate security measures would be needed to protect any remaining artifacts or documents that might be at risk. Isabel Moro Santos had remained silent during the official presentations, but now she addressed the assembled group with the composure of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "Gentlemen, while I appreciate the various governmental interests represented here, I must point out that my family has been victimized by sophisticated criminals who invaded our privacy, stole our property, and apparently intended to sell our ancestral jewelry to unknown buyers. Our primary concern is recovering our stolen property and ensuring that those responsible are prosecuted." Her statement effectively reframed the discussion from abstract questions of cultural patrimony to concrete issues of crime and victimization. The French representatives clearly understood that pursuing aggressive patrimony claims against a theft victim would create negative publicity and potentially damage French-British relations. Mr. Hamilton seized the moment to present additional documentation that had been retrieved from the family's London solicitors during the afternoon. Among the papers was a crucial document dating to 1923, a formal legal declaration by Marie-Louise's surviving son, Prince Louis, transferring custody of all family assets held in England to his daughter Marguerite, Isabel's grandmother. This document establishes continuous family ownership through the 20th century, Hamilton explained. It also specifically mentions jewelry and precious items held in trust by English friends and transfers all rights to recover such items to Marguerite and her descendants. This provides clear legal basis for my client's ownership claims under both French and British law. The 1923 document was a game-changer for the legal framework. It demonstrated that the Orleans family had not abandoned their property at Blackwood Manor but had simply been unable to locate it during the chaotic post-war period. The transfer to Marguerite established a clear chain of ownership leading directly to Isabel Moro Santos. Lord Blackwood's arrival transformed the dynamics of the meeting once again. The distinguished gentleman in his 70s carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling significant responsibilities, and his presence reminded everyone that the Blackwood family had legitimate interests in the proceedings as well. "Inspector Hartwell, I want to begin by thanking you for your discretion in handling this matter," Lord Blackwood began. "My family has always taken seriously our historical role as protectors of refugee treasures, and we have no intention of claiming items that rightfully belong to others. However, we do require clarity about our legal responsibilities and protection from any suggestion that we were involved in improper activities." His statement demonstrated the diplomatic skill that had kept the Blackwood family in royal favor for generations. By emphasizing their historical role as protectors rather than claimants, he positioned the family as honorable custodians rather than potential thieves, while also establishing their right to clear legal protection. The family's archivist, Ms. Eleanor Whitfield, presented documents from the estate's historical records that provided crucial context for understanding how the jewelry had remained hidden for so long. During World War II, Blackwood Manor had been partially requisitioned by the government for housing refugee children, and many of the family's historical records had been moved to off-site storage for safekeeping. When the war ended, some of the stored materials were never properly returned to the estate, Ms. Whitfield explained. It appears that the records documenting the Orleans jewelry's location were among the missing files. Without those records, the family had no knowledge of the items buried in the greenhouse. This explanation resolved one of the mysteries that had puzzled Hartwell from the beginning: how valuable jewelry could remain hidden at a well-maintained estate for decades without being discovered. The wartime disruption of normal estate operations and record-keeping had created a gap in institutional memory that persisted for generations. Dr. Philippe Dubois from the French Ministry of Culture had remained silent during most of the proceedings, but now he addressed the group with a proposal that surprised everyone present. On behalf of the French government, I would like to suggest a resolution that honors both the legitimate ownership claims of Madame Moreau Santos and France's interest in preserving significant cultural artifacts. His proposal was elegantly diplomatic. The French government would formally recognize Isabelle Moreau Santos' ownership of the jewelry, while she would agree to loan the collection to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris for a special exhibition on European exile treasures. The exhibition would tell the story of noble families who fled political upheaval, using the Orleans jewelry as a centerpiece while acknowledging the Blackwood family's historical role as protectors of refugee property. This approach allows the jewelry to be properly displayed and studied while respecting private ownership rights, Dr. Dubois explained. It also creates an opportunity to educate the public about the human stories behind these beautiful artifacts. The proposal addressed everyone's core interests. Isabelle would recover her family's stolen property, the French government would achieve its cultural preservation goals, and the Blackwood family would be honored for their ancestors' humanitarian efforts. Most importantly for Hartwell's investigation, it provided a framework for resolving the ownership issues while maintaining focus on prosecuting the criminals responsible for the theft. Monsieur Moreau's radio crackled with an urgent message from Interpol headquarters in Lyon. The international law enforcement network had identified the suspects in the jewelry theft as members of a sophisticated criminal organization that had been operating across Europe for several years. More significantly, surveillance at Heathrow Airport had detected the group's apparent leader attempting to leave the country with false documentation. "Inspector Hartwell, we have Alexander Petrov in custody," Monsieur Moreau announced. Interpol confirms he is the leader of the antiquities theft ring and has been using the alias Dr. William Ashford in his contacts with noble families across Europe. He was attempting to board a flight to Dubai with forged Romanian documents. The arrest was a crucial breakthrough in the criminal investigation. Petrov's capture would likely lead to the recovery of other stolen artifacts and the dismantling of the international theft ring. More immediately, it provided validation for Isabelle Moreau Santos' account of being targeted by sophisticated criminals rather than being involved in any improper activities herself. With the criminal aspects of the case moving toward resolution, the ownership issues could be addressed through the diplomatic channels that both governments preferred. The French proposal for a museum exhibition provided an elegant solution that avoided contentious legal battles while achieving positive outcomes for all parties involved. Dr. Chambers volunteered to coordinate the conservation work that would be needed before the jewelry could be safely displayed in a museum setting. Despite its excellent condition, the pieces would require professional cleaning and minor repairs to ensure they could withstand the handling and environmental conditions of public exhibition. As the formal meeting concluded, Hartwell reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with Thomas Pemberton's nervous call about disturbances in a greenhouse. The investigation had evolved from a simple estate security matter into an international case involving art theft, diplomatic relations, and the recovery of significant cultural artifacts. The Orleans jewelry would soon tell its story to museum visitors in Paris, but Hartwell knew that the human story behind the artifacts was equally compelling. The courage of noble families fleeing political upheaval, the generosity of British families who provided shelter and protection, and the dedication of law enforcement officers working across national boundaries to recover stolen cultural property all represented the best aspects of human nature in challenging circumstances. 6 months later, Detective Inspector Marcus Hartwell received an invitation to the opening of the Treasures in Exile exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay. The Orleans jewelry occupied the place of honor in a display that told the stories of European families who carried their most precious possessions into uncertain exile, trusting in the kindness of strangers to preserve their heritage for future generations. The exhibition catalog included a special acknowledgement of the Blackwood family's role in protecting refugee treasures and Hartwell's investigative work in recovering the stolen artifacts. But, for Hartwell, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that Alexander Petrov and his criminal organization had been successfully prosecuted, preventing them from victimizing other families seeking to protect their cultural heritage. The case had taught him that the most valuable treasures are often not the precious stones and metals themselves, but the human stories of courage, generosity, and perseverance that give them meaning. The Orleans jewelry had survived political revolution, world wars, criminal theft, and international legal complications because people of goodwill had been willing to protect something beautiful and historically significant for future generations. As Hartwell walked through the museum exhibition, admiring the sapphires and diamonds that sparkled under the carefully controlled lighting, he thought about the morning mist at Blackwood Manor and the nervous caretaker who had made a discovery that changed so many lives. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important investigations begin with the smallest disturbances in the most unlikely places.